Dorian Price had envisioned a life in Phoenix that looked a certain way: slow mornings with coffee on the patio, weekends filled with the smell of grilled food drifting through the backyard, and afternoons where his nephews could run freely across the lawn without a single worry. After years of saving every paycheck and carefully picking a neighborhood that felt safe, he thought he had finally found it. The desert sun, the quiet streets, and the warm breeze promised a life of stability and comfort. But the illusion of peace can shatter in the smallest, most unexpected ways. It started subtly. Dorian noticed the sound of footsteps near the fence late one Saturday morning as he was flipping burgers on the grill. At first, he thought it was a neighbor walking along the sidewalk. But the figure he glimpsed, a man in a crisp HOA patrol uniform, was climbing down the other side of the fence as casually as if it were a garden gate, barely giving Dorian a glance. "Hey! Is there a problem?" Dorian called out, wiping his hands on a towel and striding closer. The man paused, smirked, and adjusted his belt. "Just checking the area," he said flatly before walking away, leaving Dorian standing there, his palms tingling with anger and disbelief. There was no apology, no acknowledgement that he had entered someone else's property. It felt off, and yet Dorian brushed it aside, unsure if he was overreacting. Perhaps this was normal in gated communities, he thought. Maybe HOA officers had wide discretion in their patrols. But then it happened again. And again. Every time Dorian turned around, it seemed, that same man, Colin Dresner, a patrol officer employed by the HOA, was cutting corners through his backyard, ignoring polite requests, and undermining the peace he had fought so hard to create. Dorian's neighbors had noticed it too, though none of them had done anything publicly. Janine Morales, who lived across the street, whispered during a block party, "He's always cutting corners. Sometimes I'll see him hop into people's yards just to avoid walking around." Nobody says anything. Henry Cho, a neighbor a few houses down, gave a bitter laugh. "Yeah, because every time someone complains, the HOA tells us it's for our safety." Safety, my foot. With every story he heard, Dorian's stomach tightened. He had worked years for his home, every paycheck saved, every sacrifice made, and now it felt like a revolving door for a patrol officer who didn't respect boundaries. The thought of it gnawed at him late into the evenings, long after his nephews had gone home and the city had settled into a quiet hum. One Tuesday evening, Dorian caught Colin in the act again. The man dropped into the yard with practiced ease, looking around with the same casual authority he had shown every time before. "Colin! You can't keep doing this!" Dorian shouted, anger finally rising past restraint. Colin stopped and turned slowly, his eyes cold and dismissive. "I'm authorized to patrol the community. Don't get in the way," he said. That tone, sharp, dismissive, cold, made Dorian clench his fists without realizing it. He understood in that instant, this wasn't going to stop on its own. Later that night, Dorian sat with his sister Renee, listening to the laughter of his nephews from the next room while venting his frustration over dinner. "I bought this house thinking it would be safe, but how is it safe when some guy keeps hopping my fence like it's a park bench? I've called. I've emailed. I've been polite. Nothing changes. You can't let this go on, Dor," Renee said firmly. "The boys were in the yard last weekend when that man climbed over. What if they think it's okay for strangers to do that? What kind of message does that send?" Her words sank deep. It wasn't just about privacy, it was about dignity, about teaching his nephews that boundaries mattered, and that standing up for them was non-negotiable. Dorian didn't want conflict. He called the HOA office again, speaking directly with the president, Leonard Briggs. "Look, Leonard, this has to stop. Colin's trespassing. If he needs to patrol, fine. But not through my yard." Briggs sighed. "Our officers have discretion. If you've got a problem, put it in writing. But I can't micromanage every patrol." That night, Dorian stood on his back porch, staring at the fence that had become a symbol of intrusion and frustration. Anger and helplessness swirled in equal measure, but also something else, an idea forming slowly: if the HOA wouldn't protect his rights, he might have to protect them himself. And deep down, he knew it wouldn't stop here. By the time summer rolled into Phoenix, the trespassing had become routine. Dorian Price had lost count of how many times Colin Dresner had scaled his fence, each intrusion chipping away at his patience. What had started as a minor irritation had morphed into a full-blown violation of trust. Dorian wasn't the type to raise his voice or make public scenes. He tried the rational approach first. Late one evening, he sat at his laptop, fingers hovering over the keyboard as he composed an email to the HOA board. Carefully, he explained that Officer Dresner had been entering his backyard repeatedly without permission, causing discomfort for his family, and urged the board to direct officers to use community walkways rather than trespassing. The response arrived the next day, a curt note from the HOA secretary. "Your concern has been noted. The patrol team has discretion in their routes." Dorian exhaled sharply. Discretion, the very word that had become a loophole large enough for Colin to treat his yard as a shortcut. But Dorian didn't stop there. A week later, after spotting Colin hopping the fence again, he called the HOA office directly. "Leonard, it's Dorian Price. We've spoken before, but this continues. Colin Dresner keeps climbing my fence. My nephews were in the yard last weekend, he scared them. You can't tell me that's appropriate." Leonard's voice was calm, almost rehearsed. "Mr. Price, our patrol officers are trained. They're doing their job. If they feel the need to enter, it's within their judgment." Dorian's patience snapped. What judgment does it take to know climbing into someone's backyard without permission is trespassing? Briggs gave a long sigh. "File it formally if you want, but I can't tie the hands of our security staff." The message was clear. The HOA wouldn't act. The next community meeting was Dorian's chance to make his voice heard. He stood among neighbors in the bland, faintly coffee-scented room, waiting for the open comments segment. When his moment came, he spoke steadily, projecting over the murmurs. "Officer Dresner has entered my property multiple times. This isn't once or twice, it's routine. My family doesn't feel safe with it. This is unacceptable." Murmurs spread through the room. Some neighbors nodded, while others avoided eye contact. Leonard adjusted his glasses, responding with the same defense Dorian had heard before: "Our officers patrol for the safety of the community. They must have flexibility." Janine Morales raised her hand. "I've seen Colin cut through yards too. It's not just Dorian." The board exchanged uneasy looks, but Leonard pressed on, unwilling to admit fault. "Unless there's evidence of misconduct beyond patrol, the policy stands." After the meeting, Dorian faced Colin in the parking lot. "You really think shouting in there will stop me?" Colin sneered. "Maybe you should worry less about me and more about keeping your lawn trimmed." The line stung, but Dorian clenched his fists and walked away. He knew losing his temper would only play into Colin's hands. That night, he called Renee. "They're not going to help me," he admitted. "They're protecting him," she said softly. "Because admitting he's wrong makes them look bad. You can't count on them." Dorian's voice was low but determined. "Then I'll do it myself. I've tried every channel, they don't care." "He doesn't care. The only way this ends is if I show him I'm serious." Renee's warning was sharp. "Be careful. Men like him don't take embarrassment well. He's going to push back." "I know," Dorian said firmly. "But I'm done being ignored. Let him find out how wrong he is." The next Saturday, the Phoenix sun pressed down like an unrelenting weight. Dorian's nephews ran across the backyard, tossing a football with reckless energy. Dorian sipped water and enjoyed their laughter, until he heard the heavy thud against the fence. Colin Dresner vaulted over the panels with ease, landing squarely in the middle of the yard, startling the boys. "Colin!" Dorian shouted, rising from his chair so fast it tipped over. "Routine patrol," Colin muttered casually, scanning the yard as if he belonged there. "You just scared my nephews half to death. You don't walk into someone's backyard without permission. You certainly don't climb over when kids are playing." Colin's gaze flicked toward the boys, then back to Dorian. They'll be fine. Nothing to worry about. Dorian's blood boiled. I warned you. I've spoken to the board. I've emailed. I've been polite. And you're still trespassing like this is your playground? Colin smirked. Maybe if you weren't so uptight, you'd realize I'm here for your safety. You ought to be thanking me. The boys froze, looking to their uncle for guidance. Dorian's older nephew whispered, Uncle Dor, can we go inside? Yes, Dorian said firmly, never breaking eye contact with Colin. Go inside now. The boys hurried indoors, glancing nervously over their shoulders. Standing alone, Dorian felt a shift inside himself. It wasn't just anger anymore, it was resolve. The HOA wouldn't protect his rights. Colin would continue testing boundaries. And someone needed to draw a line. That night, as Dorian sat on his porch under the cooling desert sky, he stared at the fence that had become a symbol of frustration. He thought about his nephew's frightened faces, about every ignored call, every sigh from Leonard Briggs, and every smirk from Colin. If the HOA wouldn't act, he would. And next time, he would make sure Colin understood the boundary in no uncertain terms. The following week, Dorian immersed himself in research. Every night, after his nephews were asleep and the house quieted down, he scrolled through forums, watched DIY security videos, and read articles about home safety. He didn't want a simple no trespassing sign or a camera that could be ignored. He needed something that would clearly communicate boundaries and make repeated violations costly. Renee watched him from the kitchen doorway one evening. You're obsessed, she said lightly, though concern flickered in her eyes. I can't just sit back, Dorian replied, rubbing his temples. They won't stop him. The HOA refuses to act. He doesn't care. If I don't do something, this escalates further. Be careful, Dor. This isn't just about a fence. It's about your safety too, Renee warned. Dorian nodded but didn't look convinced. He wanted a solution that was legal, visible, and effective. After hours of searching, he stumbled upon an idea, an electrified gate system designed to deliver a safe but shocking deterrent. Legally, it was permissible on private property as long as it was clearly marked and didn't cause permanent harm. Perfect. The next morning, Dorian drove to the local hardware store. He picked up insulated wiring, a low-voltage shock system, and a set of warning signs. He returned home and began work, measuring carefully, testing circuits, and ensuring the system was secure. By late afternoon, the final wires were in place. The metal gate now concealed a low-voltage electrical deterrent, hidden from casual view but ready for any trespasser who ignored the obvious signs. A warning label faced the street, Danger, Electrified Gate. Authorized access only. Dorian stepped back and surveyed his work. His hands ached, and sweat dripped down his face, but he felt a rare satisfaction. This was more than just defense, it was a statement. That evening, he sat on the porch with a glass of iced tea, watching the street. His nephews played quietly indoors. He wasn't expecting action tonight, but part of him hoped for it, a test to confirm the system worked. It came sooner than he thought. Around 9 p.m., a shadow fell across the yard. Dorian's eyes narrowed. Colin Dresner. Again. Not tonight, Colin, Dorian muttered under his breath. Colin moved confidently toward the gate, as if nothing in the world could stop him. He paused, reading the warning sign. His smirk faltered for just a moment, then he shrugged and reached for the handle. The shock was immediate. A jolt ran through Colin's body. He yelped, staggering back, hand gripping his chest, eyes wide with disbelief. Dorian, seated calmly on the porch, didn't rise. He just watched. Colin recovered quickly, brushing off the surprise with an embarrassed scowl. What the hell? Dorian called out, loud enough for Colin to hear, that's your boundary. This is my property. You won't cross it again without consequences. Colin's face flushed red, and he stumbled over the uneven ground, muttering threats under his breath. Dorian stayed seated, sipping his tea, unshaken. The gate had spoken for him. After Colin disappeared down the street, Dorian exhaled slowly. A sense of relief mingled with triumph. Finally, he had regained control. The fear, frustration, and repeated violations that had consumed him for months were replaced by a quiet satisfaction. Renee came out, her eyes widening at the scene. "Did he really?" "Yes," Dorian said simply. "He learned the hard way. Hopefully, he'll remember." The next morning, Dorian's neighbors noticed the newly installed warning signs and gate modifications. Some whispered, some laughed quietly. No one crossed the fence anymore, and Dorian's yard finally became the safe haven he wanted for his family. That night, he sat on the porch again, listening to the desert wind rustle through the trees, the sounds of his nephews laughing inside. He realized something important: sometimes, patience wasn't enough. Sometimes, boundaries had to be enforced. And while the HOA had failed him, he had taken matters into his own hands responsibly and safely. In the distance, the streets were quiet. The patrols would continue their rounds, but Dorian knew they would think twice before trespassing again. And for the first time in months, he felt a sense of peace in his own backyard. The following morning, Dorian awoke to a quiet street, a stark contrast to the weeks of tension that had filled every moment of his day. The low hum of the air conditioner, the occasional chirp of a bird, even the distant bark of a neighbor's dog felt almost surreal. For the first time in months, his backyard felt like his own. But Dorian knew better than to get complacent. Colin Dresner didn't give up easily. He was a man used to authority, used to control, and he didn't take humiliation lightly. The low-voltage deterrent had made its point, but Dorian could already sense the brewing storm. Around mid-morning, Dorian noticed the familiar white HOA patrol truck rolling slowly down Hawthorne Drive. Colin was behind the wheel, his expression unreadable. He didn't stop. He didn't even glance toward the yard. Dorian exhaled. So far, so good. By late afternoon, word had begun to spread through the neighborhood. Neighbors whispered at fences, exchanged glances across driveways, and peeked out windows. Some congratulated Dorian quietly, others simply observed. The general consensus was clear: Colin had been knocked down a peg, and the community was starting to notice. Renee stopped by that evening, dropping her boys off for a weekend visit. "So, the fence?" she asked, eyeing the carefully mounted warning signs. Dorian nodded. "Worked like a charm. He didn't even touch it." Her eyes softened, though worry lingered. "Good. But men like him don't forgive easily. You've embarrassed him in front of half the neighborhood. Expect pushback." "I know," Dorian admitted. "But I can't let him keep treating my property like a shortcut. I've given him every chance." Renee placed a hand on his shoulder. "Just document everything. Keep the cameras running. Don't give him any chance to twist this." Dorian nodded, already planning the next step. The cameras, installed strategically around his property, would capture every approach, every lingering glance, every act of trespassing. If Colin tried anything, there would be proof. That night, the silence was interrupted by the faint hum of gravel under tires. Dorian's heart skipped a beat. Peering through the blinds, he saw Colin's truck parked 2 doors down, engine off. Colin stepped out, walking slowly, deliberately, as if measuring his next move. He paused briefly, staring toward Dorian's yard before turning and walking away. The next day, Dorian reviewed the camera footage. Colin had lingered near the fence, almost testing the boundaries, but he hadn't touched the gate. Dorian allowed himself a small smile. The message had been received loud and clear. By midweek, the HOA office called. Leonard Briggs, the president, requested a meeting with Dorian to discuss the escalating situation. It was the first sign that authority might finally recognize the problem. Sitting across from Leonard in the community office, Dorian laid out the facts. "I've documented repeated trespasses," he said, sliding a folder of camera screenshots across the table. "Emails, phone calls, neighborhood testimonies, everything. This isn't a personal vendetta. It's a pattern of harassment. And the deterrent was the only way to protect my family. Leonard adjusted his glasses, leafing through the papers. His expression was a mix of irritation and begrudging acknowledgement. Mr. Price, I admit, this has gotten out of hand. The board failed to act when it should have. But using an electrified gate, that's serious. There are liability concerns. Dorian remained calm. I followed the law. The system is low voltage, safe, and clearly marked. The liability comes from the repeated trespassing, which you ignored for months. Leonard sighed. You may be right. Colin's actions were inappropriate. And the board will take disciplinary measures. Effective immediately, he's suspended from all patrol duties until further review. We'll also revise patrol guidelines to prevent this from happening again. Dorian nodded, feeling a mix of relief and vindication. The HOA had finally recognized the seriousness of the situation, but he also knew the suspension didn't erase Colin's arrogance or humiliation. The man would likely be plotting his next move. That evening, Dorian returned home to the sound of his nephews laughing in the yard. He poured himself a glass of iced tea and stepped onto the porch, letting the warm desert air brush against his skin. For the first time in months, the yard felt like a place of safety and peace. Neighbors began stopping by, offering quiet congratulations and words of thanks. We couldn't say anything, Janine Morales admitted, leaning against the fence. But seeing you stand up, it inspired us. Dorian smiled. Sometimes, boundaries need to be enforced. Silence doesn't solve anything. As the sun set, painting the sky in deep oranges and purples, Dorian reflected on the ordeal. It had been about more than a fence. It had been about respect, dignity, and protecting what belonged to him. Colin had tested him repeatedly, and the HOA had failed to intervene, but by standing firm and acting decisively, Dorian had reclaimed his home. The battle wasn't over entirely, arrogance and resentment didn't vanish overnight. But Dorian knew one thing for certain, he would never allow anyone to cross his boundaries again. And in that knowledge, there was a quiet triumph that no trespasser or HOA patrol officer could ever take away. The days following Colin Dresner's suspension were a strange mix of relief and tension. Hawthorne Drive felt quieter, yet the air still held the memory of confrontation. Neighbors who had once walked past each other with polite nods now exchanged subtle glances and murmured behind closed doors. Some were curious, some cautious, and some quietly grateful for Dorian's unwavering stance. Dorian spent the mornings on his porch again, sipping coffee and watching his nephews play safely in the yard. The low-voltage strip on the fence had become more of a symbol than a necessity, a reminder that boundaries mattered and that courage could enforce them. But Dorian knew the real work wasn't over. Respect had to be earned and reinforced, especially in a community that had allowed a man like Colin to exploit his position for so long. It started with conversations. Janine Morales stopped by one afternoon, leaning against the fence with a small, approving smile. You really shook things up, Dor, she said quietly. I don't think anyone realized just how much control he thought he had. Dorian shrugged, a faint smile tugging at his lips. It wasn't about showing him up. It was about showing that he doesn't get to intimidate everyone else. Word of the incident traveled quickly. By the weekend, a few neighbors were approaching Dorian with cameras, videos, and personal accounts of Colin's trespassing. Some had been hesitant to speak up before, worried about backlash from an officer who seemed untouchable. Now, empowered by Dorian's example, they were willing to contribute evidence. Henry Cho handed Dorian a flash drive one morning. Cameras on my garage caught him a few times last week. It's all there, he said. If he tries anything, we've got proof. Dorian nodded, feeling the weight of collective effort. This wasn't just about him anymore, it was about establishing a standard in the neighborhood. Boundaries, respect, and accountability weren't optional. The next HOA meeting was packed. Every chair filled, the atmosphere thick with anticipation. Dorian stood at the front, the room quieting as he connected his laptop to the projector. I've been accused of creating a hazard with a low-voltage gate, he began, his voice steady. But the real hazard has been Officer Dresner trespassing repeatedly and ignoring repeated complaints. Today, I have proof. One by one, the videos played. Colin climbing fences in daylight, slipping through yards in the dead of night, smoking in someone's backyard, each clip punctuated by gasps, whispers, and incredulous looks from board members and neighbors alike. By the fourth clip, the room buzzed with outrage. "This is harassment," someone shouted. "Abuse of position," another added. Colin, sitting in the second row, sprang to his feet, voice shaking with anger. "This is taken out of context. I was patrolling for safety." Dorian's voice cut through the tension, calm but firm. "Safety doesn't involve trespassing. It doesn't involve scaring children. It doesn't involve treating my yard as your shortcut." The board struggled to regain control, banging gavels and urging order, but the narrative had shifted. Neighbors were no longer silent witnesses, they were active participants, demanding accountability. Leonard Briggs, the HOA president, cleared his throat, his expression uneasy. "We will review disciplinary measures immediately," he said, his voice betraying the weight of months of negligence. Colin stormed out before the board could finish, his departure marked by slammed doors and muttered curses. In his absence, the room erupted into applause, small at first, then growing as neighbors voiced support for Dorian's courage. That evening, as Dorian walked back to his house, he felt a sense of vindication. The fence wasn't just a boundary, it was a symbol of dignity, respect, and collective action. Neighbors who had once whispered in fear were now speaking openly. People understood that standing firm, even when ignored, could inspire change. Over the following weeks, the HOA implemented stricter patrol guidelines, hired new officers trained to respect private property, and established a hotline for resident concerns. The community slowly shifted from passive spectators to engaged participants. Boundaries were no longer theoretical, they were enforced, acknowledged, and respected. One quiet Thursday, Leonard Briggs came to Dorian's porch. "Mr. Price," he said, looking worn but sincere, "I want to apologize. You were right. Colin's behavior was unacceptable, and the board failed to act. The low-voltage system was within your rights. Thank you for standing firm." Dorian nodded, relief washing over him. "I just wanted my home to be safe. That's all." Renee and her boys joined him in the yard, tossing a football back and forth. Laughter rang through the air, a sound Dorian hadn't realized he had missed so much. The conflict had tested him, challenged him, and at times frightened him, but standing firm had preserved something far more important than comfort: dignity. As the sun set over Hawthorne Drive, Dorian glanced at the fence one last time. The low-voltage strip glinted faintly in the fading light, more symbolic than functional now. The battle was over. Respect had been earned, boundaries had been drawn, and the community had learned a lesson: courage, action, and unity could overcome arrogance and abuse of power. And for Dorian Price, the yard finally felt like home again. The weeks after Colin Dresner's permanent removal from patrol felt almost surreal. Hawthorne Drive, once tense with whispered complaints and nervous glances, began to breathe again. The fences, the lawns, even the sidewalks seemed lighter, relieved from the invisible weight that Colin's unchecked authority had imposed. Dorian Price spent the mornings on his porch again, coffee in hand, watching his nephews chase each other across the yard. Their laughter echoed across the street, a sound that had been muted for months. It wasn't just a return to normal, it was a reclamation of safety and dignity. The low-voltage strip on the gate had become a quiet symbol, reminding everyone of the line that should never be crossed. But Dorian knew the real victory was more than electronics or fences, it was the change in mindset he had inspired. Neighbors who had once turned away from confrontation now approached Dorian openly. Janine Morales stopped by one afternoon, leaning against the fence. "It's different now," she said with a smile. "People aren't afraid to speak up anymore. You showed us that standing firm works." Dorian nodded, feeling the quiet satisfaction of a hard-earned victory. "It's not just me. Everyone here deserves to feel safe. I just took the first step." Even the HOA seemed to be learning. Leonard Briggs called a few days after the suspension, asking for input on new patrol guidelines. Dorian suggested clear boundaries, mandatory reporting, and respect for private property, changes that were immediately implemented. The board also created a hotline for residents to report concerns, and officers were instructed to patrol only public areas, maintaining visibility without trespassing. For the first time, policies aligned with the principles Dorian had been advocating since the beginning. Life on Hawthorne Drive began to return to its natural rhythm. Children played freely in yards, neighbors gathered for block parties, and the silent fear that had loomed over the street dissipated. Dorian noticed subtle but meaningful changes. Greetings became warmer, conversations more open, and even casual observations carried a sense of accountability. People who had once stayed behind closed doors were now engaged participants in their own community. One evening, Dorian's sister Renee brought the boys over again. They ran across the lawn, their energy unrestrained, tossing a football back and forth under the fading sunlight. Dorian watched them from his porch, a quiet pride swelling in his chest. This, he thought, is what it's all been for. Safety, dignity, respect, it's more than just a fence. Even as peace returned, Dorian remained vigilant. He knew arrogance could re-emerge if boundaries were ignored. So, the cameras remained, the low-voltage strip stayed in place, and neighborhood communication grew stronger. The subtle lesson had been learned: respect isn't given, it's enforced through vigilance and courage. The final test of the community's newfound confidence came when a minor dispute arose between neighbors over parking spots. Rather than escalating into arguments, residents approached each other calmly, discussing solutions openly. Dorian saw the reflection of the same courage and assertiveness he had used against Colin in these interactions. The neighborhood had internalized the lesson: confront problems early, document them, and act decisively. At the next block gathering, Janine raised a toast to Dorian. "Here's to showing us that silence doesn't protect anyone," she said, her voice carrying across the lawn. "You stood firm when no one else would, and now we all know we don't have to be afraid." Laughter and cheers followed. Dorian smiled, though he quickly added a joking note: "I don't recommend using electricity as a first solution, but sometimes a firm boundary is the only language people like Colin understand." The group laughed, but the underlying truth of the statement lingered. Respect wasn't optional, it was earned, defended, and maintained. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the desert sky with streaks of orange and pink, Dorian walked along the edge of his yard. The fence, once a source of frustration, now stood as a monument to what persistence and courage could achieve. Each board, each nail, each small strip of wire symbolized the principle that had carried him through months of conflict: no one had the right to strip away the peace of your home. For Dorian, the final victory wasn't just about confronting a single man, it was about shaping an entire community. He had taught them that authority doesn't grant immunity, that silence allows abuse to flourish, and that courage, even when it feels uncomfortable, can restore balance. Later that night, as he sat with a fresh glass of iced tea, the yard finally quiet except for the distant hum of desert insects, Dorian allowed himself a deep exhale. His nephews were asleep, Renee had gone home, and the neighborhood had settled into a calm rhythm. He felt a profound sense of relief, not triumph, not vengeance, but restoration. For the first time in months, the yard felt like his again. It wasn't just a space of grass and fences, it was a sanctuary of respect, boundaries, and courage. Dorian realized that protecting what's yours isn't always loud or confrontational. Sometimes it's deliberate, careful, and unwavering. And when you stand firm, you don't just defend yourself, you teach everyone around you the value of their own boundaries. The lesson was simple, but powerful: silence lets arrogance grow, but courage sets the limit. And when you set that limit, the respect you earn doesn't just protect you, it shapes an entire community. The first days of autumn on Hawthorne Drive carried a calm that had been absent for months. The desert heat softened, and the neighborhood seemed to exhale collectively, as if the tension that had gripped it through the summer had finally been released. Dorian Price sat on his porch, a cup of coffee steaming in his hands, and watched the world around him resume a natural rhythm. Children ran freely in yards, neighbors exchanged greetings without suspicion, and the once dreaded HOA patrol trucks now passed along the street without incident. For Dorian, the change wasn't just external, it was deeply personal. The months of harassment, trespassing, and ignored complaints had left their mark, but they had also forged a quiet resilience. He understood, now more than ever, that boundaries weren't merely lines on a map or the wood of a fence, they were declarations of respect, dignity, and self-worth. By defending them, he hadn't just protected his family's safety, he had redefined what it meant to live in a community where people could trust one another. Neighbors approached him differently now. Janine Morales waved from her porch as she watered her small flower beds. "Morning, Dor," she called with a smile. "Feels good to just sit outside without worrying, huh?" Dorian nodded, returning the smile. "It does. Makes you realize what we were all missing." Even the HOA had shifted its approach. Leonard Briggs personally stopped by one morning to check on the changes he had promised after Colin Dresner's removal. The new patrol guidelines were being enforced strictly, and complaints were no longer brushed aside. Officers were trained to respect private property, maintain transparency, and document any unusual activity. The hotline for residents was functioning, and Leonard admitted with some humility that Dorian's persistence had forced the board to rethink how authority should serve a community, not intimidate it. Beyond policy changes, the community had adopted a new culture. Where once neighbors whispered anxiously behind closed doors, now conversations were open, direct, and solution-oriented. Minor disputes, whether over parking, landscaping, or shared spaces, were addressed calmly and constructively. The lesson Dorian had embodied, courage and clarity in defense of boundaries, had rippled outward. People were no longer afraid to speak, to question, or to assert themselves respectfully. Dorian's nephews were the true beneficiaries of this transformation. One sunny afternoon, they were outside, tossing a football across the yard with abandon, laughter spilling into the street. Dorian watched from his porch, heart swelling, feeling the relief and joy of seeing them safe in the space that had once felt vulnerable. Renee joined him, leaning against the railing. "It really is over, isn't it?" she asked softly, a mix of pride and relief in her voice. "For now," Dorian replied, watching the boys dive and tumble on the grass. "But the lesson here is bigger than any single person. It's about showing them, and everyone around us, that boundaries matter. That safety and respect aren't optional." Renee nodded. "And you've shown them how to fight for it without losing their dignity. That's powerful." As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows over Hawthorne Drive, Dorian reflected on the months that had passed. He thought of Colin Dresner, the man whose arrogance had sparked this ordeal, and how his disregard for rules and respect had ultimately isolated him. It wasn't the low-voltage strip that defeated Colin, it was Dorian's unyielding commitment to principle, his courage to act when the system failed, and his ability to document and demonstrate the truth. Arrogance, Dorian realized, could survive only where boundaries were invisible. The low-voltage strip on the gate remained, not as a weapon, but as a symbol. It was a reminder of the line that should never be crossed, a testament to the power of measured action, and a signal to the neighborhood that boundaries were to be respected. In a sense, it had become a silent guardian, standing watch over the peace that had been so hard-won. Hawthorne Drive was quiet now, not from fear, but from a restored sense of community. Residents walked the sidewalks, greeted each other warmly, and treated one another with the consideration that had been absent during the months of conflict. The neighborhood had transformed from one where silence allowed abuse to one where courage and accountability shaped daily life. Dorian sipped his coffee, letting the cool autumn air settle around him. The yard was calm, the house secure, and the community awake to the lesson he had fought so hard to demonstrate: silence lets arrogance thrive, but courage sets the limit. And when that limit is enforced thoughtfully, boundaries aren't just lines, they're the foundation of respect, safety, and community. As the sky deepened into night and stars pricked the darkening horizon, Dorian felt a sense of completion. Not triumph, not vengeance, but clarity. The yard was his, the community had learned, and the lesson of standing firm when ignored had been etched into the neighborhood's collective memory. For Dorian Price, and for Hawthorne Drive, peace wasn't just restored, it was earned. And for the first time in months, Dorian could simply sit, sip his tea, and watch his world in quiet satisfaction, knowing that some lines are worth defending, no matter the cost. The following days brought a new rhythm to Hawthorne Drive. The tension that had gripped the block for months seemed to dissipate, replaced with cautious optimism. Dorian Price woke each morning to the quiet hum of life returning to normal, kids riding bikes, neighbors chatting across fences, and the occasional friendly wave from passing cars. Yet, beneath the surface, a subtle vigilance remained. He knew that real change didn't arrive instantly, it had to be nurtured and reinforced. The HOA had begun to implement reforms in earnest. Leonard Briggs and the remaining board members reviewed patrol policies, emphasizing strict adherence to sidewalks, documentation of incidents, and immediate reporting of complaints. The hotline was live, and residents began calling with small grievances they had previously ignored, reassured that their concerns would finally be addressed. For the first time, the system that had once dismissed Dorian felt accountable. Dorian spent time walking through the neighborhood, reconnecting with neighbors who had quietly supported him from the sidelines. Janine Morales stopped to greet him outside her house. "It's different now, isn't it?" she said, glancing toward her yard. "No more surprises, no more fear." Dorian nodded. "It is. But it's not just about us. People are watching, and the message needs to stay consistent. Boundaries matter here." Even Henry Cho, who had provided the crucial camera footage, admitted that the community dynamic had shifted dramatically. "Before, everyone whispered," he said, leaning against a mailbox. "Now, people are talking. They're standing up when they see something wrong." "You sparked that, Dor." The boys' laughter became the soundtrack of the neighborhood once again. Dorian's nephews ran through his yard, tossing a football, their confidence restored. He watched them from his porch, feeling the sense of safety he had worked so hard to achieve. Renee joined him, her arms folded across her chest, a proud smile on her face. "This is what it's supposed to feel like," she said. But Dorian knew the work wasn't just symbolic. Colin Dresner's departure left a gap in accountability, but it also set a precedent. Other residents, especially those who had endured harassment or felt powerless, began documenting incidents themselves, ensuring that no one could exploit authority unchecked. The low-voltage strip on Dorian's gate, now more of a symbol than a deterrent, reminded everyone that boundaries are tangible, enforceable, and respected when necessary. The HOA held another meeting, this time with the intent to rebuild trust. Leonard Briggs opened the floor. "We've made mistakes," he admitted. "But we're committed to ensuring every resident feels safe and respected in their own home. Policies will reflect that." Residents listened, voices interjecting respectfully but firmly when they felt policy gaps remained. The atmosphere was different from before, less fear, more engagement. Dorian, seated near the front, observed quietly. He didn't need to speak. The change he had fought for was visible in every nod, every raised hand, and every affirmation from the neighbors who had once been hesitant to challenge authority. It was a rare kind of victory, one measured not in humiliation inflicted or revenge taken, but in the quiet restoration of trust. Days turned into weeks. Patrol officers now followed strict guidelines, avoiding residential backyards entirely. They waved politely to residents, reinforcing transparency and professionalism. Conversations on the block shifted from whispered complaints to proactive problem-solving. The community, once fractured, was slowly knitting itself back together, stronger and more aware of its collective responsibility. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, Dorian stepped onto his porch with his nephews trailing behind. The yard, once a site of fear and tension, was now alive with play, laughter, and freedom. Dorian glanced at the gate, the strip glinting faintly in the light. It no longer needed to serve as a physical barrier, its role as a reminder of respect and vigilance had already done its work. Renee joined him, her eyes reflecting the fading sunset. "You've changed this neighborhood, Dor," she said softly. "Not by fighting, but by standing firm and showing everyone that boundaries aren't negotiable." Dorian took a deep breath, the cool desert air filling his lungs. It wasn't easy, he admitted. And it's not over forever. People like Colin don't disappear entirely. But for now, we've drawn a line. We've made it clear what's acceptable and what isn't. His nephews called for him to join their game, and he smiled, stepping down to the grass. The ball flew toward him, and he caught it with ease, feeling a sense of belonging and control he hadn't felt in months. Around him, neighbors waved, shared smiles, and paused to enjoy the evening. The lessons of the summer, the importance of courage, clarity, and action, were now visible in the community itself. As night fell and the stars appeared above Hawthorne Drive, Dorian knew the story of Colin Dresner would linger in whispers, cautionary tales, and laughter. But the greater story, the one about standing firm, defending your rights, and fostering respect, would continue, etched into the neighborhood's collective memory. Boundaries had been drawn, respect had been demanded, and the community had learned a vital lesson: silence allows arrogance to grow, but courage sets the limit. And on this quiet street, under a vast Arizona sky, Dorian Price finally felt that limit had been set.